Hello, my name is Tarmo Ramel, and I've got this short introduction tutorial to Excel to show you today. We're going to start off by looking at the screen. What you see in front of you is what you get when you launch Excel for the first time. And while it's possible to modify and tweak how things look and how you interact with this interface, this is the standard setup and default setting, although of course it won't have my name up here in the top corner. It should have your name indicating that you're logged into the system and authenticated as a user. However, what's obvious here is that we've got a bunch of stuff going on, and my goal is to show you some of the important pieces so that we can get through this course, because we're going to be using Excel as the primary tool for doing our statistical work and presenting our work. Now, Excel isn't by definition a statistics package, but it does statistics really well, and it's a relatively comfortable user interface. So let's dive right in. So you'll notice that my mouse has a yellow highlighter behind it, just so that you can see it while I move it around on the screen. And currently it's pointing to this relatively large white space, a bunch of grid cells. And this, I like to call this the canvas. This is where we insert our data. This is where calculations are performed. Up above that is an open box with some buttons next to it. This is the formula bar, and this is one location where we can enter formulas. Otherwise, we can enter them directly down here in the cells. You might be looking at that and saying, it's a little bit hard to see, the text is a little bit small. If you move down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there's a slide bar, and you can move this number up or down to just change the amount of zoom. So basically, how many rows and columns are you seeing currently on the screen? It doesn't change your data in any way, it just changes how it appears to you. We can always use these sliders to go farther to the right and left, or the sliders to go up and down. And we can have a very large number of columns, and as we get to column Z, it just starts at AA, AB, AC, and it keeps going all the way to the end, and there's way more columns here than you'll use in this class. And similarly, the rows are numbered sequentially across the side as you go down all the way to the bottom. But again, we're generally going to be working here in the upper left-hand corner of this worksheet. These worksheets are given names down here, and when we're working through the course, you'll find workbooks that have more than one worksheet. Currently it's called sheet 1, but we can always double click on there and rename them. If we want to add more worksheets, we can just click on the little plus and change these things and call them whatever we wish, and so on. So we can simply click from one tab to the next, and anything that we have on one tab or one worksheet is going to be independent from those that we have on other worksheets. It's a great way to organize the work for question 1 on one worksheet, the work for question 2 on a second worksheet, maybe having a worksheet for rough trying out of things, and then when you're ready and it's working, you can transfer that stuff back over to where you'd like it to be. But anyhow, we're going to have workbooks. That's one Excel file that has multiple worksheets, and we can access those worksheets by clicking on the tabs across the bottom. We can also click on any of the cells in our view. I'm going to go back to the original screen because I'd already zoomed it in. But if we click on a cell, that cell has an address. And this one here is in column A, row 1. This cell is called A1, and we can see it listed up here in the corner. This would be B1, C1, D1, and so on. And as we go farther down, this would be B6, and we can refer to any location in this worksheet based on its address. And we're going to use those addresses as we start to build calculations a little bit later on. So anyhow, worksheet or the canvas, lots of cells, each cell has an address. which is a letter number combination. Then up at the top we have these ribbons, which are pretty common now in Microsoft Office, and each ribbon has a series of buttons and options attached to it, and we're going to use some of them, but there are way more options on here than we're going to get to, but they're things that you might want to explore and look up on because they might provide you with all kinds of benefits and help. So we can look at the home ribbon, the insert ribbon, the page layout ribbon, the formula ribbon, and so on. These things all provide tools that are grouped together in a way that make them easy for us to use and easy to find. And sometimes when we're working on things, new ribbons will pop up that are contextualized to what we're working on, but they're not always available because we don't need them when they're not being referred to. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of this functionality offers us. We can put our cell cursor on any location. Let's say cell C2, and we can use our keyboard to enter text. I could type my name, for example. And when I hit enter or click my mouse somewhere else, it has now entered that text into this cell. Notice that the text spans farther than the width of the C cell, but that's just for display. All of that information is actually in the cell C2. How do I know that? Well, right now I've got cell D7 selected, and notice that in the formula bar there's nothing showing up. This cell is completely empty. But if I select C2, it brings up the contents of that cell. If I click on D2, which looks like it has MEL in it, it's also blank. So sometimes if things are really long, or a long string of numbers are really wide, they're going to spill beyond the edges of your cell. So we can take our mouse pointer and we can put it on the boundary between two columns, between C and D, for example, and notice that the pointer changes to a vertical line with two arrows pointing outward. When we hold down our left mouse button, we can now drag the width of that column and make it wider. So it's not overlapping things that are in the next cell. Why is that important? Well, what if I had here a number that I happen to like, 753. Well, if the column was really narrow, then it would cut off and overprint one cell on top of the other, which means that we don't see what's written in those cells. It makes it a little bit useless to us. So we can again go and widen the cell so that we can see exactly what's in there. And there are many ways to do this, obviously by holding down the mouse button and dragging, but we could also put our mouse pointer at that location and simply double click with the left mouse button. And it will expand the width of the column to exactly the width that will contain the material that is in that cell. We could, on any given column, right click and then head down to column width, and then we could specify a number and how wide we want that column to be, maybe 25. So there you go. We can play around with column widths. We can do all of the same thing with row heights by placing our cursor between rows along the left margin, the same way that we did with our columns. It allows us to ensure that things line up nicely for presentation purposes. We may also want to modify what our text looks like. This is just like working in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. We can select the cell that we're interested in, and we can click the capital or the bolded B to bold our text, or click it again to unbold it. We can italicize it, we can underline it, and we can perform a whole series of operations with our font the way that we're used to doing that. So when there's a small downward chevron or an arrow next to a button, it means that rather than clicking on the button, if we click on that chevron, it opens up additional menu items for us to select from. So in this case, changing the color of our fonts. So notice that when I clicked the underline button, it underlines the text or the numbers. I could do it here for our numbers. Oops, wrong button. The numbers within our cell. But sometimes we want to actually draw the bottom or the sides or the top boundary of our cells, and for that we use this button here, which is for borders. And currently it shows a series of grayed out borders but a black line across the bottom, and if I click on that, you'll notice that it's now put a line across the cells that I had highlighted. So the line or the boundary of the cell is not the same as the underline of the contents that are inside the cell. So if I wanted to remove the underlining, I could just simply go there and click there, but I now have this nice border underneath. You might say, well, maybe I don't only want that bottom border. What options do I have? Well, I'm going to highlight those two cells. I'm going to hit this downward chevron. And you're going to notice that there are lots of different border options that you can select from, which allows you to, again, create nice tables, nice presentation of your data results. So using these font tools allows us to manipulate the text the way that we're normally doing so, and adding annotation and information to our worksheet that allows us to quickly interpret what it is that we're looking at. So for example, instead of having my name just sort of sitting there for no reason, what I might have is name, age, IQ, ID, all kinds of different things. And then rather than having these things underlined, go there and select no border, I can put values next to these and so on. 22 years old, pretty amazing, hey? Anyhow, notice that the awkwardness here is that this column is really wide, and then some of the values in these cells are left justified, that is, they start at the left side of the cell and are written out towards the right, and some things start on the right margin, and this creates a table with sort of disjoint lines. So what we could easily do is select the entire row, and from the align buttons, force everything to be aligned the same way. I mean, there are all kinds of traditions and things that we can talk about, but we do have now this ability to adjust the alignment of contents of an entire column, entire rows, or of selected rows, where we can move them to the left, we can move them to the center, we can move them to the right. Generally, the rule of thumb is if you have text, you left justify it, and if you have numbers, you right justify them. It makes reading them a little bit easier. So generally, in a given column, you have to have the same kinds of data. So you have text in one column and numbers in another column, which means that the example that I have here isn't a good way to organize this sort of data. But what's really powerful about Excel is not that we can type in information into cells, but is that we can use those cells to contain values with which we perform calculations. So Excel really is a big fancy calculator with all kinds of functionality built in, but we could do something relatively simple. Let's imagine that we want to write the result here of the age plus my IQ. Again, not a really meaningful thing, but to do that, we have to insert a formula. And in Excel, a formula always starts with an equal sign. So we say equals, and then we click on this cell and notice that it automatically knows that it's C3, and we wanted to add, so I'm going to hit the plus key, and we were going to add it to, what was it, my IQ? I forget. Let's add those together, and then when I hit enter, it's going to put the sum into the cell. So 172. So 22 plus 150 gives me 172. We could do it in our heads. It's relatively simple, but this is really great. But what's amazing is when we click on this cell now, notice that the formula shows up here, not the value 172. It tells us that we're taking the value that's currently in cell C3 and we're adding it to the value that is in cell C4. And you say, well, why is that great? Well, the nice thing is, because it's a formula, if I go over here and I change that 22 to a 25 and I hit enter, the formula will always update. So regardless of what my inputs are here, the formula is going to be dynamic and always keep that result correct. So we don't, if we change an input value, we don't have to go in there and change every calculation manually. Everything on the sheet updates automatically. So we can look at this a slightly different way. Imagine that we take these values and we put a let's put a thick bottom border here, and let's get rid of the name and terms. I'm just going to highlight them and hit delete. And what I'm going to put here, total. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, well, this cell is going to be this plus C5. So there we have a sum of those three values. There's an easier way to do that, because usually we're not only adding together 2 or 3 numbers, we might be adding together thousands, and if you have to do them all plus, it's going to take forever. So let's go back up to this cell, let's hit delete, and let's learn a new function. Equals sum, and I'm going to open bracket, and I'm going to hold down my left mouse button, I'm going to highlight the cells that I want to add, and then I'm going to close the bracket and hit enter. The same result, but notice that the calculation here is the sum C3 to C5. It shows up in the formula bar, it shows up in the cell, and allows us to keep everything nicely organized. This value over here could be that we're going to take function, we're going to take this value, and we're going to add 10 to it, which is really nice, because if we go back over to our original data, and I change this to, let's say, 100, then not only does my total change, but also this. So this cell, if I double click on it, shows us C6 in blue. It highlights the cell for us in blue. We can see C6 plus 10 up in the formula bar, but it shows us exactly where the values are coming from on our worksheet to perform the calculation that we want. The plus 10 is constant, we've already just typed it in, so it's not pulling it from anywhere, but it's one of those things that we could change to a constant that we're pulling from somewhere on the spreadsheet. So rather than putting in plus 10, why don't we say, let's put in the value from C1. And right now C1 doesn't have any values in it, but I could make this 29, and it's now going to take these three values here, it's going to sum them into this column, then this cell is going to say C6 plus C1, so it's going to take the value from here, and it's going to add the value from up here. And if we double click on this cell, you'll see that C6 is shown in sort of blue, and C1 is shown in orange, and it highlights on the page where those values are coming from, which allows us to track through our equations and make sure that they're working. But what makes this even easier to deal with, you say, well, you know what, I don't want to add the value from C1. I want to add the value from C3. We can simply drag by grabbing the edge of this orange box and drop it down where we want it, and notice that the equation updates for us. So it's still taking the value from C3, but now it's adding it to the value from C3. When we're happy with those changes, we hit enter and our equation is updated. So we can use this spreadsheet to modify and change equations, to perform calculations, but it also allows us to annotate them and present them in a nice, clear way. You say, well, I don't like this value over here. I don't like this value. I'm going to grab the edge and I'm going to drag it down here, and let's call it bonus. So we can move things around simply by dragging them, and the formula still remembers the reference of where those values come from. So really, really quite handy. And it's really great. We've looked at simply adding things together and using the sum function or using the plus sign, but we can use all of the regular operators that we're familiar with. So let's imagine we say 10 minus 9, so we can use the minus sign. We could say 9 times 7, so we can use the asterisk as a multiplication sign. We can say 81 divided by 9, so we use the slash, and we can do division. And we can piece these all together using the rules of BEDMAS and put in brackets. We can do exponents, so 2 to the power of 4, so we use the chevron or the caret, which is above the 6 on your keyboard. These allow us to perform all of the basic types of mathematical operations that we might come across. And we're going to have a whole series of built-in tools that allow us to get through, but it's really worthwhile to play around a little bit with Excel to become familiar with where things are and what things look like. And we're going to sort of layer on top of this as we go week through week. All right, have fun, and we'll talk again very soon.